So Molly Burhans is a cartographer and the founder of GoodLands, an organization established with the goal of nothing less than mapping the entirety of the Catholic Church's land holdings and promoting its use for environmental and social justice purposes. She has a master's degree in ecological design from the Conway School, and she studied philosophy as an undergraduate. In February this year, probably some of you, I know some of you, also read the absolutely fascinating profile of Molly in the New Yorker. That's where certainly I learned about this project and her work, and we're so glad that she's able to join us tonight. She's joining us from Germany, where she is currently holding up before the events next week in Scotland. Yeah, as I was saying, this profile in the New Yorker gives us a sense of what GoodLands is doing with the Catholic Church, although I'll be curious to hear where things stand with that at the moment, given the pandemic. But it's fantastic to have her in this series on religion and climate change because of the kinds of questions that her interest as a cartographer and as someone interested in environmentalism and social justice bring to the fore. Molly is going to be joined tonight by my colleague Manan Ahmed, who is an associate professor of history here at Columbia University. Manan is an expert on the intellectual history of South and Southeast Asia, the critical philosophy of history and colonial and anti-colonial thought. If you know Manan, you may have at some point had a conversation with him about his deep fascination with and interest in cartography and maps, which is why I thought this might be a really interesting pairing, even though he's not an expert, at least that I know of. Maybe we'll find out tonight, an expert on the Catholic Church. I think he brings a really fantastic perspective, and I'm looking forward to the conversation between Molly and Manan after her talk. Manan, let me just say, he is the author of two books, the most recent of which is called The Loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India, and that came out with Harvard University Press, I think in 2020. Just a few points of orientation for you in the audience. Molly is going to appear any second and deliver her talk. She's going to talk to us for about 30 minutes. Then Manan will engage her in some conversation for about 15 to 20 minutes on the basis of what she has to say and maybe some kind of shared interests and themes that emerge. And then the floor will be open to you as the attendees to pose your questions and comments. You can do so at the bottom of your screen. There should be a Q&A function available to you as attendees. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A function at any point, really from now going forward. You don't have to wait until Molly is done with her talk, or indeed until Molly and Manan are done with their conversation. And Manan will be able to field those questions to Molly. We will then wrap up at around, well, not at around, at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Before I turn it over to Molly, let me just flag the next event in this series. This is the Religion and Climate Change series. As I mentioned, we have an event next month called Faith in Thoreau, looking at the work of Thoreau in relation to the environmental movement and his many and varied interests in religion and spirituality. So please do join us for that next month. You can find more details on our website. But without further ado, I would like to turn over now to Molly, and once again, a very warm welcome to her and to you all.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me and see me? Fantastic.
Yes.
I really appreciate that warm welcome, Matthew. And it's just, I'm so just honestly excited and honored to be here. I first actually met with colleagues from Colombia back in 2017 when I was in the, if you read the New Yorker article, the eating beans and crying phase. I'm still kind of like a little bit beyond that, but so little funding. I bootstrapped this from almost nothing. And Jeffrey Sachs, I'd met him in the Vatican. He invited me to head over and kind of do some work there. But I also knew people from CSUN who did really amazing work. So seeing religion finally kind of integrate into this whole sustainable development, data, imagery, spatial information, and then that final layer is really exciting. And I'm so honored and grateful for this conversation that we'll be having after this talk. And I encourage everyone in the audience to ask any questions, even hard ones. Catholic land is an intersection of a lot of possibility and a lot of issues. So my goal is to really do kind of a visual overview that helps you understand how we work, what we do, and why, and the impact. And that will create a foundation for us to really dive in to our conversations. If there are any architects, design students in the audience, which most, I would say, people who aren't of that persuasion wouldn't notice, but we're in the middle of transitioning to multiple graphics. So there's a little bit of discontinuity in colors and stuff. And I know for the average person that doesn't matter, but for me, it can be, I feel your pain. We're getting there, but it's, let me just share my screen and let's get started. So what screen can you see? I've got two screens. Let's do, can you see this PowerPoint?
Yes. We can see, great. Well, actually, I don't know yet. Now, yes, we see the Earth, yes, okay.
Okay, perfect. So what if the Catholic Church managed its land sustainability? It's the big question here. Well, about 18% of the world's population is Catholic. That's 1.3 billion people. 1 in 4 healthcare facilities around the world is Catholic. And the Catholic Church serves over 35 million children each year in education. That doesn't include Catholic universities. Further, oversees the largest NGO network of humanitarian aid around the world, providing services to millions. And it owns a lot of land. It owns monasteries, hospitals, chapels, retreat centers, even oil wells. And you wouldn't believe this, but it owns mountains. So this is a map of Catholic properties in the United States. And many different types. So this is a point map. We have parcel maps, and this is actually from 2017. And as you can imagine, since this came out and since we developed this, there's much fewer, and it's actually directly tied to abuse cases and lawsuits, why this map is getting lower and lower in its content of properties, not only attendance. So one of these properties, a monastery, is really where my story starts. It's the Erie Benedictines. They are famous for having Joan Chittister, a feminist nun, who lives there. But while I was in college, like some of the people on this talk might be, I was a little bit older because I'd founded my first company, which is a worker-owned cooperative vertical farm. So I was founding this company at the time and thinking about becoming a nun at this monastery. And I would look out every day from this chapel and I just see vast amounts of land that were ripe with possibilities for sustainable agriculture, habitat patches. I'd walk through hundreds of acres of forest on this property before I'd go downtown to ministries that they ran, a soup kitchen, education for refugees, and I just see that every single one of their missions could be multiplied through regenerative land use. And growing up in Buffalo, New York, where I'm originally from, it is a town it was kind of like Detroit. We had houses for $1. My first encounter with property for a purpose before I joined the monastery, this is my terrible haircut at the time, but this was me in college with everyone. And now I'm at this monastery, actually right now. I took this photo earlier today, but in Buffalo was the post-industrial landscape. You could buy a house for $1. And the first time, I didn't lead this effort, but people I knew really made land for good was actually a squat. A bunch of people from high school went to this like prestigious magnet high school, had squatted a house, and I joined in. And we saw that a mansion, which we eventually got from the city, transformed our lives and people around us through guerrilla gardening and a more activist approach before I entered the social entrepreneurship space. So how did I get from a squat in a mansion in Buffalo to a monastery and thinking about regenerative agriculture and starting a company to the Pope's, well, people say unofficial cartographer because I'm renegotiating. I turned down the original offer. It's because land can't be understood without maps. So just to give my overview of how powerful maps are nowadays, if you don't live in this space, really, this polygon simply delineates all these different variables: population, development patterns, landforms, hydrology, geology, habitat within the Potomac River watershed. This is a simple line, but when you put that on a map, it shows the boundary between Turkey and Syria. And that line carries so much weight for so many lives. And bird nerds in the audience might recognize these. These are migratory flyways, showing the paths that different species of birds migrate each year. And why I'm bringing this up is because a map is one of the most powerful tools that we have for understanding the world we live in, but also creating blueprints for our future in a way that integrate spatial science, in a way that integrate even narrative, geopolitics, and quality and quantitative information in a unique way. And in 2016, I led a team that made the, first global map of a major world religion in history. Now, when I say that, it was a huge project. I was an invited researcher at Esri, so I had access to what ended up being all 3,000 staff at their headquarters. We didn't work with them all, but we worked with a lot of teams, the core team, about 20 people. And what this meant was we mapped out these jurisdictions, which you're looking at right now, which are unique to the Catholic Church. So unlike geopolitical boundaries like countries or states or counties or cantons or provinces, the Catholic Church has its own global set of boundaries that don't always conform to geopolitical boundaries. So it's kind of a cop-out to say it was the first map of a major world religion globally, because there really can't be any other in this sense. The Mormons have a similar structure, but they aren't considered a major religion. Why that matters and kind of the lexicon will help you see how this approach is so much more, I would say, impactful beyond the Catholic Church, but also stirs really the imagination about geo-governance. My first talks were actually at the Harvard Government School before any ecology or land use program. So this map that you're looking at for terminology is called Bishops' Conferences or Ecclesiastical Conferences. So we're in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB, And you can see that these conferences generally conform to countries, but not always, like North Africa spans a couple countries. And the level below that, so akin to states in the US, is called provinces. And there are some darker patches here on this map. This is the one level where they do not contiguously cover the earth, because you need to have kind of a classification of an archdiocese and a diocese, which I'll get to now. So these are dioceses, which are equivalent to counties in a sense, and there's about 3,400 of them around the world, and there's a lot of different types. So the blue on this map denotes archdioceses. And if you're in New York City, you're in the New York Archdiocese, in the New York province, and right next door to you is probably the Bridgeport Diocese or the Brooklyn Diocese. And these other colors are mission territories, like apostolic vicariates, and a number of different categories. So land and religion, these two factors brought together and visualized on a map are immensely powerful. I don't think there's been two factors really that have shaped the course of human civilization more than religion, the cosmology that people embrace that guides the direction and understanding and frame of reference for them, and also the land that they're on, the resources they have access to, and where they can go and be. At the same time, these are two really contentious points as well as high leverage points. So the Catholic Church is one of a multitude of faith-based organizations, which the UN estimates owns about 8% of the habitable land on Earth. That's about, and they also own about 5% of commercial forests. Right now I'm sitting in a beautiful 7-hectare vineyard owned by the Benedictine religious order. That 8% is equivalent to about the size of India and Sudan combined. Without these faith-based actors, just to kind of drill this home, we won't solve climate change or biodiversity loss in time, period. We have to figure out how to engage, and not just through, say, prayer networks, which are really important, or activism, which is really important, but through actually the land they own. If we don't figure out how to engage them with the land they steward, we will not solve climate change or biodiversity and loss in an appropriate amount of time. About the Catholic Church, I mentioned earlier 1.2 billion Catholics, just to reiterate. Actually, it's 1.3 now, 18% of the global population. Largest non-governmental network of healthcare, education, second after all of the member organizations of the United Nations, so largest NGO kind of umbrella network for aid. And they own a lot of land, even still today. And looking at historical maps, they essentially, with the doctrine of discovery, claim territory over most of the continent of North America. So no one was helping them steward this land, manage it, and now, as we've seen, deal with the fallout of the historical errors of the Catholic Church's past and the reconciliation required. So I founded GoodLands initially, to be honest, because I thought I'd find somebody else doing this work because it seemed so obvious. And along the way, it was really surprising to learn at each step. It was kind of a, wow, there's no one here, there's no one doing this, until I made it all the way to the Vatican. So just to give an overview of like what I mean by stewardship, which is a really weighted word, I realize that, or ecological design, I think about regenerative design, which I've actually had training in and have implemented with, design build teams. So this is a like ecological parish plan. Your typical parish, kind of, mown lawns and really simple. And the idea that you could make it into a place that supports habitat, stormwater management. So diverting water from, going into existing sewer systems and sinking it back into the ground, supporting not just the ecology, but the local community and even the economics of the space. Now, these are quite, if you're at a computer, you should be able to read these, and I'll send the slides along. But these are just some examples of the integration of the economic elements of a project like this. The communal, adding in contemplative gardens, community space allotments, and the ecological. The issue is something like this plan costs anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000, and it's not that special. If you go to any landscape architecture firm or engineering firm that has substantial training in regenerative landscape design and planning, this is pretty much something that they could offer, but it's not sustainable in any fiscal way for an organization at the scale of the Catholic Church or others. Further, the Catholic Church doesn't pay any taxes on their properties in the United States and most parts of the world. So all of these things like stormwater management or even conservation easements don't have a business model to fit where you're usually incentivizing people to put these programs on their properties because they won't have to pay tax or they'll get a tax break. So we had to come up with a completely new kind of business model to help the Catholic Church actually afford implementing these programs. And that involved being able to take an entire portfolio of up to over 3,000 properties in one diocese and classify it based on its potential for allotments for these different kind of optimized programs. What are the 10 properties that will benefit the community and the people around them most in the landscape most from, say, tree planting or from conservation? And how can you make up for those losses through intelligent real estate management? The other big issue is migration and relief in some parts of the world. What properties are ripe for setting up an emergency camp or disaster response? And we have actually, I should say, a piece of software we developed that uses machine learning that integrates all the Catholic properties we've mapped and continuously kind of learns where to best optimize sites. In addition, obviously, the community involvement is critical to any of this, but this helps us really kind of merge the science to make informed decisions and classify all of these properties based on, say, the yellow is where you should put, investment in 10 trees. And you'll have a not only 200% return on investment financially, but you'll also impact over 10,000 lives, potentially with lower rates of asthma, with increased tree planting in areas that don't have any urban canopy, etc. And to be able to scale that, we had to zoom out to the scale that I mentioned earlier, the diocese on the global scale. And I guess we didn't have to, but I knew that, once again, affordability has been a huge problem in this whole domain. And as an Ashoka Fellow, I know people that have been hacking at regenerative agriculture and climate solutions in land use and ecosystems restoration for decades. And this is always the issue, is how can we get this from one property that's like idyllic to this global scale? And the Catholic Church is actually a really amazing initial pilot, I would say. Talk about a pilot project that's like one of the hardest that you could deal with, but to do this, because now we can do algorithms in one diocese, and we classify those dioceses based on a number of different variables that we've already mapped, such as loss of tree planting days, deadly heat waves under different climate scenarios, so we can do predictive modeling, even for migration, where there is the most tree cover loss currently, where there's the highest CO2, we've done a CO2 footprint, ultimately leading to the ability to internally reapply programs. So we create, and this is kind of very heady, so I'm fine at taking questions about this afterwards and going back, and I will send my slides so that you can look over them if you'd like. But so we created planning prototypes. So working with scientists and other solutions engineers that have pre-packaged programs like dealing with impervious surface and stormwater management. And those will be reapplied to all the dioceses within one prototype package. Another prototype might be dealing with, say, immense religious conflict and inward emigration or outward immigration and have a totally different response that someone like Catholic Relief Services or Jesuit Refugee Services is much more appropriate. And those planning prototypes, we really focus on getting them to land record digitizers and helping them plan for disaster response immediately with a longer term plan that's less focused on kind of the ecological in the moment. And the challenge to this all, in addition to not having the financial model, was the land records. I started calling up dioceses about 2014, thinking that we would go in, we'd get a property portfolio at the least in a database, and we'd map it out and be able to apply all these high resolution spatial analyses. And what we found was exactly what you're looking at here. Just pretty much boxes and old file cabinets and diocese basements, not even consolidated in one church across all the different parishes, all the different monasteries. Nobody knew what they had. And further, they didn't even have Excel spreadsheets. I mean, this was not only, it kind of started to dawn on us, a project and a movement for land transformation, but also digital transformation, which has been a massive amount of work. So this is Boston Archdiocese, and this is just a map of all the different parishes where we found records, which was scattered all over the place, in addition to assessors' offices. And even for that global map of dioceses, when we went to check, there was nothing. And so I worked with students at Yale starting in the fall of 2015. And I had the prototype ready to go, and we were working on a project with classifying dioceses, the initial approach. And because we couldn't find the boundaries, I said, it's fine to do this in counties, it's kind of an idea, or in subnational boundaries. And a couple of the students were really just enthusiastic, even outside of class, to work with me. And we all just kind of really dug into this, absolutely certain that we must be missing something, that this global institution must have jurisdictions for its governance mapped out, like a diocese is what a bishop or cardinal governs. And it led me to the third loggia, the Abstain Palace, which is the two pictures here show, which has just the most amazing fresco maps painted on the wall. And the Apostolic Palace is inside the Vatican City. It's where the Secretary of State is housed. And I had ended up there when I was 26. After working with students at Yale for about a year and searching and beginning this journey a couple years ahead, I was there to ask for their diocese boundaries. And in the off chance, I suppose, that they didn't have any of these maps, I thought, there must be some reason for geopolitical security. Of course, land and religion is really fraught with issues as well as ripe with potential. So this whole time I've had to be in contact with, obviously, bishops, priests, women, religious Catholics from around the world, especially from fragile states. And I suppose, God, they must have this, but there's got to be a reason why they don't. So I found myself being led down this hall as a 26-year-old woman who was just confirmed not that long ago. And I sat down with the Secretary of State's office and I asked to speak with their geographer. They said they don't have one. So I said, can I speak with your cartographer? And priests looked back at me and were like, oh, we don't have one. So I showed them the prototypes of the maps and I said, do you have these? I have the opportunity to lead a team that just did the UN Administrative 3 boundaries, so like the diocese level boundaries. And is there any reason I shouldn't? And the prelate spoke in Italian for about 5 minutes, and I wasn't sure if you could be excommunicated for even just asking a question. To be honest, it was terrifying. They looked back and they said this would be useful for everything. So I went off to California and led the team that created these boundaries. And we premiered them in 2016, December, at the Vatican Arts and Technology Council. And these provided the first container, like any sort of boundaries. So you've seen a lot of COVID maps probably this year where you're looking at counties or census tracts. The church had no way to track anything globally. It hadn't ever seen its presence or its people in any global sense, or had any policy way to track, say, property mapping. Where in some places it needs to be approached with a high level of security and respectfully and responsibly, much more than I would say in places like the US, where you have digital land records available. And when we premiered these, it was the first time any prelates, any of the Vatican leadership had seen the global Catholic Church that they govern. And you can't see it here, but I'm going to make a note that I usually don't, but around the edges of this map are the visions of St. Heldguard von Bingen, who's an amazing 10th century mystic who I'm in the monastery area of where she worked. So I had a little nod to this phenomenal woman in these maps that were premiered there. And this is a pre-shortage map. And you can find these online. I'll send the link after. In 2018, I think it was my 4th audience with the Pope, I got a little bit more time, and he gave me permission to establish a cartography institute in the Vatican, which would be the first female-founded institution in the history of the Roman Curia. And contrary to popular legend, I didn't turn down the Pope. So it's presented much more harshly. I am renegotiating. I was offered a $30,000 budget, but more so, the fact is when you're geo-enabling a country, which the Holy See is, not just a religion, you need to have an infrastructure for standards and all this other kind of information to help them do it responsibly. And so I can't just run off and make more maps for the Holy See, which is why I'm renegotiating that right now, actually. I'm just going to kind of speed through this to get to the discussion, because I'm really excited about that. But just to re-ground where this conversation came from was why we're doing mapping at all, is you can't plan or manage land without maps. It's really like trying to build a building without a blueprint. And this is green infrastructure, like habitat connectivity contributions for all the Catholic properties in the US. It's really useful to be able to classify properties based on their value for an entire property portfolio. But the thing is, because we're helping with digital transformation, those initial maps that we make, which is actually the vast majority of the work that we do, those maps provide an immense amount of data that is really useful for a lot of goals beyond our own. For example, pastoral planning, or I mentioned disaster response. Now, we have a business model that doesn't rely on data sales of the data, because I can get into that if there are any curious business-minded people in the audience. One of the big issues is property sales in the church and security, but also really trust in this community that has had a lot of under sales of property in the past couple decades, especially. So they own the data in a sense. We do have an internal repository that's anonymized, but they have their own data, and we help enable it and stand up a system internally so that they can actually manage it and maximize data for good while making land work for good. These records help a land record, especially in, places where there's a lot of immigration, places where land records are not digitized yet, like across an entire nation, is immensely powerful. Southeast Asia, I'm going to bring this up because it's really poignant, like Vietnam, post-communist land records there enable, say, the Catholic Church to bring their ownership disputes to a court of law, which is really critical because while the government doesn't own the land under its jurisdiction anymore, it does turn a blind eye to non-state actors, not just for the Catholic Church, but many religious institutions who own land in the area. And a digital government grade land record enables them to bring that to court of law. Further, a land record alone can help people get personhood status if they don't have any records about who they are or documentation. And we don't do the boots on the ground digitizing of land records, I should say that. We have an entire partner network that does this kind of work because it's really intensive, but it's absolutely worth it. And internally, just kind of standing up cloud-based systems so that it can be managed and maximized really for impact amongst partners. One of the things is kind of the integration of this across scales, which has been not only of interest to the Catholic Church, but to other global transnational actors. So the Catholic Church, remembering back to that global map, is really kind of a blueprint for meta-state or post-nation state governance for some people. Looking at an actor that is non-state, that is distributed in these very, to think about maps and data, in this very high resolution cells, thinking about how geopolitics and conflict even work now, these minute kind of communities that have these parcel scale levels that go up to a regional scale, which in this sense has a formal governance structure, which most of those examples of non-nation state governance do not, and then also has a global scale, which is unique to Catholic Church. The Pope can say, not everything he says is infallible, but he could say, put out some sort of proclamation that makes the abandonment of property of great ecological value come with a weight of excommunication. For example, that's an example I'm using because the abandonment of property of great value that's owned by the church right now comes with a canon law consequence of excommunication, just financial value at the moment. But being able to integrate these extra layers will enable those kinds of papal proclamations coming at this global scale to really immediately cause parcel scale impact. And the only reason why we've really worked on that global scale, I want to emphasize, is because of the absolute lack of infrastructure, of policy that's required to do this respectfully and responsibly for an entire global religion. And to lay the framework for all these other global institutions tied with the Catholic Church, whether it's these massive NGO networks or religious orders like the Benedictines or the Jesuits, they all are just beginning their digital transformation journey in the geographic sense. And they're about a decade behind where we are. And everyone will run into this issue of needing geopolicy. And without an intelligent framework, it's very high risk, not just for the Catholic Church, but for any religion entering this space, if they don't create some sort of frameworks and unified conversation about geo-data policy and security and standards. And I found this to be a really big issue actually at State Department meetings, UN meetings across the board is, we're entering Faith for Earth in the UN was, launched in 2017 and we're pushing forward Laudato Si and all this stuff. And without these standards, there's a lot of risk. So I'm really hopeful that the Catholic Church can actually be a model for that, which is necessary to go down to kind of all these different levels, whether it's the classified diocesan level or that really gritty parcel level. And the thing about the parcel level, no, this is kind of, I would say, where our work stops and where the dream starts and where the Columbia Climate Program, I'm really interested in hearing about your approaches to climate and data and land regeneration, because this is where it happens. The parcel scale, the boots on the ground. So this is an example of a farm that I designed. So this is a kind of colorful blueprint of what was built. And this is these are photos of the actual structures and kids building the rain garden for stormwater management. So it's sinking water on site instead of having it go into some big nasty combined sewer overflow system. It's got a farm stand. All of these kids are at-risk youth, and it's building so much more than just ecology. You know, when people think of planting a tree, when you do this in a spatially aware sense, it builds community, health opportunity, education, recreation, food security, ecosystem services. And this was just an empty lot. And think of the Catholic Church. There's thousands of these within a diocese. The San Antonio Archdiocese, or I should say Santa Fe Archdiocese, just put up 800 lots. 800 lots. And that's not even touching the kind of like the brunt of their portfolio. They put these up for auction just 2 months ago to pay off the abuse settlements. And most of these lots were vacant. They weren't parishes. They were owned by parishes. And being able to transform some of these lots will really create kind of a new, I would say, renewal within communities, which the church itself has not been able to fulfill. And the process of doing these kind of designs also creates a massive amount of data. Going back to that original, how do we scale this problem of doing all the analyses that you really need to do a site scale project that has ecological integrity well in a way that's scalable creates a massive amount of data. Whether you're looking at tree canopy as the context for a single site or even sunlight. Tree planting programs that are not informed are a huge waste of money and time. I think anyone who is in ecology will back me up with this. We get immensely frustrated. We want to plant, 1 million trees, but where you plant those trees matters. And, if you plant a tree that needs a lot of sunlight and dry soils in a place that's shady with wet soils, it's just going to die. And this happens all the time. So being able to map out a property, such as a light analysis or utilities analysis, are you going to plant a tree over an underground wire? I mean, all these things usually don't go into these tree planting programs, but they're really important. At the same time, they just require time. These graphics are extracted from PlanSet, professionally done, from a project I worked on. But to actually do these kinds of measurements and analyses, you don't need to make them look really good. You just need to do them and record them. And that is one of the major questions that I think we're facing right now, is how to get this boots on the ground, informed analysis as a framework to transform sites once we find that they are the optimal places for projects that don't require the big stakeholders that are involved in the planning process, so like a mayor's office and affordable housing, but really these tree planting, no-mow programs. How do we get these champions to actually do these projects in a way that not only is informed, but maybe can integrate that data up across these scales, not only for us, but also the scientists that we use the analyses from, kind of bridging the gap, I would say, from bench to garden bedside. I'm going to stop there because I'm really excited about questions, but yeah, I guess that's what we really do. We're taking this idea of ecological design, we're scaling it. In the process, ended up making the first global map of a major world religion for a country that didn't have any geographic standards. So laying that framework, including for digital transformation, and really like moving forward, I would say we have so many requests, and it's just navigating right now a lot of really delicate spaces to ensure that this happens at each step with prototypes that work, but also improve. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. Hello, everyone, and I'm sure that you've been fascinated and riveted with this presentation that we've heard. So please, I welcome all of you to put your questions and comments in our Q&A tab or in the chat so we can incorporate them into the conversation as we move forward. So I wanted to perhaps I wanted to understand a little bit more, both the way in which property, that you oftentimes said the word property, but then oftentimes they use the word land. And I wanted to see how you're thinking of these two things, land and property, and B, how does the Vatican think of these things? Like, what is the Vatican's idea of property? What does it mean? And I want to say a little bit about why I think it's such an incredibly generative thought for me, because as we kind of see in the history of even the kind of settlement of United States under the, let's take, for example, John Locke's Constitutions of the Carolinas, in which land that under Locke's or the Constitution's purview is lying fallow, is without labor, where native communities, according to, again, the settler colonial argument, have not tilled it, have not gotten fruit from it, or if there's fruit, anyone can pluck it. So under the constitutions of the Carolinas, that land can only be converted into property by inputting labor into it. And that labor, however, is only recognizable if the laborer is part of the church. And so the Catholic Church, in that sense, or the church in that sense, it's the Anglican, but the church then becomes an important part of how to convert land into property. And so I was curious, and I wanted to see in your conversations how you see these two words operating at all, and what do you think the Vatican thinks of these two words, land and property? So does the Catholic Church have land, or does the Catholic Church have property?
I would say both.
Okay.
I'll start with first how I use them in the Vatican. How I see land is a palimpsest, essentially. So this is a great way to describe. So palimpsest is essentially vellum that people who were scribes used to rewrite over and over, and they've kind of had the ghost of the past on it. So when I think about land, it's a very spiritual word to me. And land is both that record geologically, historically, spiritually, emotionally, ethnically, for everyone who has ever lived on it, walked through it, been moved by it, in addition to the place. The sense of place, I think, is really tied with land. When I say property, so it's kind of like rectangles and squares. Property is land. Land use is how you're using land, land use planning. And these get conflated a lot because a lot of times people think that land is just a landscape and not the building. No, when I say land, I mean the building, I mean everything. Everything on it now, in the past, and potentially in the future. Property is really it carries more financial weight and legal weight and political weight. So property is a properly delineated parcel, or token, you could say, of land, and it is viewed, I would say, how I use the word, from a very, a much more heavy economic, and I would say a more formalized. Formalized is probably the wrong word to use, but a more, I would say, rigid, kind of calculatable system with parcels and all of this. How the Catholic Church and the Vatican views land is very interesting. I can't speak on behalf of the Vatican, but I can speak on behalf of what has been happening since even I first approached them with this idea. So this past summer was massive for property of the Vatican. The cardinal who gave me my first office there before the Pope, which somebody blocked internally, thankfully, was indicted on a $500 billion property scandal. We're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars worth of assets here. So we're seeing them, I think, look at that as, I don't want to say shame, but they're finally owning up to the fact that the poor church, which really is, like, most of the people underpaid, like the cardinals with like a $10 million apartment are like 1 in 1,000, is really rich. And we can finally add some liquidity to that with technology. They're also looking at the doctrine of discovery. Pope Francis is really the first pope, I would say, to really address this issue, which pretty much said, not just said, but encouraged colonialism of land. So their entire shift, I think, is based on an ecological approach, which historically you do hear the nice stories, I'm going to say this, that are true about certain priests or sisters, even up to Dorothy Stang, who was murdered for helping indigenous communities and local communities with regenerative land management in the Amazon basin. But the vast majority of what happened during the colonial period was that property and that takeover kind of view that came with it. And I think the Vatican's trying to shift it. And I would say that since the age of exploration, especially in the last century, it's been blinders up. That's why they don't have these records anymore, because it's such a big issue. You couldn't tackle it without technology, to be honest.
Right. No, I not being as obviously as versed in the history of the Catholic Church, I do, however, can see the blinders part of the equation, that there is a necessary hesitancy. And I think it's tied to, I have another question, but maybe I can just continue this line of thought for a minute. I think it's tied to not only the long history of the doctrine of discovery and deep investment of the church in colonization and harvesting of souls, etc., but also, I think, as well, to the histories of decolonization, right? So if we think of decolonization period, of anti-colonial period, the premise of decolonization, very succinctly put, is that the colonized get to repossess the land. That's like a one sentence that I can cite from Aimé Césaire about what decolonization means: repossession of land by the colonized. And what actually happens in the post-colonies, is that while the nation state emerges out of British Empire or French Empire or Portuguese, etc., Dutch rule, the church gets to keep the properties, as your global map shows. So the land that is presumably now in the hands of the erstwhile colonized, in terms of its national boundaries, and even new nation states that are created as partitioned from earlier understandings of land and empire, the church gets to keep that property, gets to keep that land. And I think that's where, in the early part of your conversation, you hinted at the intersection of land and religion, and I think that's correct. As in, we do need to understand that the Catholic Church does not look like the Catholic Church of the Vatican everywhere else. As in, a post-colony can understand the Catholic Church based on its faith, its religion, to be its own, and does not require decolonization that a erstwhile colonized has. And I think part of that global blindness maybe is also part of this, that we are looking at a decentering of what the Catholic Church might imagine itself to be in the colony. But I do want to just maybe ask you one more in this line of thought, one more thing, which is that how does how does the question of land and property for the post-colony register in terms of the Vatican's self-image, even 100 years? So when these new nation states come on this proverbial map, is there a kind of a historical geography that you're able to do in terms of your land usage, that these dioceses and these conferences, or I guess conferences are bigger, these dioceses and parishes, do they shift in any notable way as countries emerge during the mid to late 20th century?
This is actually really fascinating. So when we were diving into these boundaries, so a global boundary set is a huge undertaking. I want to just put that out there. Most people don't realize that, especially for ownership and jurisdiction, this is being able to look at these, so the Seoul Diocese, South Korea, crosses the border with North Korea. The maps that we have of, say, the diocese in China, which since the Cultural Revolution, there hasn't been an official non-sanctioned Catholic church there, really, or any religion. I got those actually on a dark and stormy night in a monastery while sitting with priests discussing cognac, the church over cognac, and it was probably the last boundary map, like one of the last ones that had been smuggled out. This guy just happened to have a box of all of this like paper records and information about the church in China right before that. France, the diocese conformed to geopolitical boundaries. So during the French Revolution, the government came to an agreement with the Catholic Church to ensure that they conformed with the French subnational boundaries, which made it very easy to map there, unlike these other places. And then there are some weird things, like in Ireland, there's the diocese, and they're like, we have the oldest monastery in the entirety of Ireland. And you look at the map, and this contiguous little block is the diocese, and then they just have this little circle around the monastery. So, yeah, so there's, you know, it's not all contiguous. With the land ownership and the history, now this is really where I wonder, because we're doing the right now. You know, we're about meeting immediate needs for digitization and this crisis. I would say this joint crisis of needing to help the Catholic Church financially support itself locally through better management financially of its property, to implement environmental programs to support the vision of Laudato Si and the continuation of all of our existences, but also to reconcile with the past. You know, the Indigenous schools in Canada, obviously, which are just the tip of the iceberg, like the sex abuse crisis. I'm sure we will find more examples of this across the world. So within this kind of palimpsest, I think we've moved to land at that point. One of the worst outcomes I could see would be that these properties, which we're seeing right now, are just sold off to developers. Priests and bishops are not trained in real estate sales, and it is as far as sectors go, it's a gnarly sector. You know, what we've seen in our maps is someone will sell a $100 million parking lot downtown for $10 million because someone says, oh, there's this weird shaped building on there. You know, let me just take that liability off your hands and then you can pay off this lawsuit. So the church has lost a lot, but at the same time, all the abuse victims, all the people that deserve reconciliation have lost out too in this mismanagement issue. Then the other piece is the land. So land back, you know, I think comes into the equation. And I think all of us, I've been brought on board, GoodLands has, for discussions with reconciliation. And I'm really hopeful for this because I think to heal this egregious past of the Catholic Church, it has to own it. We have to heal the land and we have to heal each other, and handing over properties without some sort of framework for helping with regenerative and getting it to the people of the place, say a real Indigenous community, not just like one person there who say, like I grew up in Western New York, so you see kind of, and I knew some people that grew up on local reservations, and the dynamics there, you don't want it to go to the wrong person there either, you know? So I think that maps will allow this meeting that needs to happen for it to really decolonize. The other piece is, okay, so this is a little bit later, garbage pickup in Rome. This is the one example I have. So in Rome, the municipalities stopped picking up garbage for everyone in the city at some point in the last 50 years, I think. And the Vatican had this old treaty that required the city to pick up their trash. And it does leave me wondering if back in those historical records of land, maybe we could find a treaty that talk about to like explode things if this was possible. Shows that the Amazon basin is largely owned by the Vatican or something like that. And with somebody in power like Pope Francis who's pushing forward Indigenous reconciliation, and with the need for this kind of unity amongst, I would just say, people who care and supporting especially the people on the front line who have been the indigenous communities in the protection of the earth. I think that that's really wildly exciting to think that that could be in the back end. We don't know because, like I said, we're in the present right now with the land records, but what the past holds, just looking at this weird example of like, they managed to get this from some treaty that was written up in, the 1400s, like what could be there? But what does it mean too?
Yeah. I mean, I think let me turn a little bit now to the sort of the other part of your presentation, and obviously perhaps the main focus of your work, which is to look forward towards a way of as you say, kind of an ecological scaling that can have a community that is regenerative, that is sustainable, that's ethical, that's plugged into communities, and where, as you say, these vacant or empty lots can be reinscribed into our for our future. And in that, of course, in thinking about this issue of the climate disaster, the climate apocalypse, I tend to be on the crazy side of these things because the city that I grew up in, Lahore, has one of the highest highest ratio of disappearing water table, and the idea, and coupled with one of the highest increases in temperature, and so we're looking at a place where my home is, where 300 million people will be displaced in the next 10 to 15, 20 years. So I see very much the necessity of the type of work that I think you're pushing towards with the land holding and property that the church is. But let me be contrarian for 1 second. And, I want us to think about it. I want to actually ask your thoughts on, mapping, as you say, is a tool for a unique way of looking. But mapping is also the primary tool of colonization, and has been, and was invented for that, and was put to that very exact purpose. And the datafication of people's languages, rituals, was tied to their erasures, as in you register them in order to dissolve them in terms of colonization. So much of the history of colonization, thus, in its intersection between mapping and data visualization, data gathering, is predicated on the question of erasure, the erasure of the community that is being colonized. Is it really a case that with more data, more more vector drawings, better kind of layers of property and land, better understandings for how individual dioceses control and negotiate, really entrenched systems of bureaucratic malfeasance in some cases, and malpractice and abuse in other cases? Is that possible for us to really hope that a visualization allows us, a mapping visualization allows us to see something that isn't simply going to lead to further erasure or further further rupture into the lives of these people? How are you thinking?
Yeah, this is actually a really good question, because I think what you're touching on is less about, when you look at the history of maps, exactly what you said. They showed where people were headed to take something that was not theirs, essentially, right? And I think we also have to look at the coinciding history of knowledge stewardship, even of the academy itself. Of the Catholic Church, I would say, in Western Europe, and then somewhat in America until, I would say, the last century. Actually, the Mormons picked it up, because people wouldn't realize that. But really, the stewards of, ancient texts. And in the Middle East, it was, different Muslim scholars that really stewarded Plato, Aristotle, Al-Ghazali, all of these, even the pre-Socratics, ancient texts from the Babylonians. Everything was really stewarded. Jewish scholars. this was kind of a lineage that was within religion, and the Catholic Church in its organized structure became an institution that carried that forward. And with that, the maps that led colonization. And we've seen really a democratization of education that we're just, I think, on the precipice of this. And we're seeing it in the crisis, I would say, of higher ed today is what's next? You know, kind of what happened to the Catholic Church, which was, I'm not going to say it because I view the Catholic Church as, for me, as a practicing Catholic, as the deposit of faith. Like that's its ultimate role, is to steward the axioms of the cosmology and the sacraments that go with that. And at the end of the day, all this other stuff that reflects its values needs to happen as a reflection of those values. But at the core, that's its role. Just like at the core, the academy's role is to steward knowledge. And I think maps are, with technology, have become so democratized. And this is what we're actually not dealing with, but trying to figure out how to navigate right now, since even we started, since I founded GoodLands over 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago. You know, what would have taken a month now with AI and vision and you know, machine learning can take a week. And it's getting easier and easier. Not saying it's perfect. There's a lot of issues with algorithms. So I don't want to say this is like a package, easy solution for anything, but it is getting cheaper, faster, better. And in that sense, looking towards the next kind of step of humanity is, for me, the maps are critical, actually. First, because you shouldn't do environmental programs without understanding the environment. I know this sounds really kind of simple, but it's true. Like I mentioned the tree planting plans that go awry, or people who put solar where it could have 200 times the impact, or what we saw was that parishes that weren't scrambling to get food in people's mouths and clothes on people's backs, and people getting connected with shelters who didn't have any home. They had no bandwidth for environmental programs, but sometimes these places could have like 400 times the impact on the health of the environment. So I think it's really about knowledge stewardship and knowledge democratization more, and how we're going to handle that as people. Now we've seen, and this deals with everything from privatization of data to open source, non-open source, you know, and what the web is moving towards right now, what we see like in the back end. So like we just went through what's called Web 3.0. So there have been all these different iterations of the internet since it was founded that most people don't, it just kind of happens. Well, it doesn't, it takes a lot of work, but most people, it just kind of happens. So Web 3.0 is what enabled, it's called the semantic web. It's what enabled genomics, proteomics, big data crunching, all of this stuff. And Web 4.0 is the geospatial web. And I think it's going to blow open everything as much, at the very least, as genomics did with, say, biology, but with any spatial science, whether it's spatial history, public health, spatial ecologies. And the question is, you know, how we're going to meet that with, I think of ecosystems actually, when I think of this. So like a hospital, like a medical school, you know, it's kind of a closed system like a body with a dermal layer. How are we going to meet the education requirements, the standardization, the need for all of this, with the fact that we're going to be inundated with just possibilities for anyone going out and doing a map, for anyone doing this information. Now, for some things like hardscape, so like if you're doing a sidewalk, you need permitting, but for a lot of the planting stuff, you don't. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's really less about maps as a vehicle, but more as a representation of where knowledge stewardship and ownership of intelligence lays. And it's becoming in the hands of the people.
I like that part of your response very much, the question of stewardship. I do have serious doubts. I think doubts largely because maybe I'm a veteran of the Web 2.0 wars, and I see what the democratization of speech has done, right? In terms of previous administration, in terms of current politics in much of the world, where the idea to form a community basically means forming of communities of hate directed against some other member of the larger public. But you know, I think going back to this idea, and then we have some questions that I want to turn to. I do ask myself, really, this is not so much directed at your work, but I do ask myself that with the effort at that we see a really stark divide between property holders and capital holders and the rentier class or the dispossessed. You know, I mean, these are stark numbers of 90 to 10 or 20 to 80, even in advanced, so-called advanced economies. That what this allows, this spatial turn, as it were, is basically allowing the capital reinvestiture into these very same protocols. So yes, there is a weird parcel of land in current day Pakistan. I was taught in a Catholic church, as in a school, cathedral school in Lahore. So if you look at it on a map, it's a weird parcel of land in the heart of Lahore. The Catholic diocese there is, you know, is vibrant community, but it perhaps has so few records of the type that you are talking about that, you know, there's a some amount of bureaucratic hesitancy that allows them to live. Now, what happens when that bureaucratic hesitancy, that blind spot, goes away? And here is a parcel of land in the heart of Lahore city, 2 steps from seats of power and commercial space, that is so-called fallow, to use the terminology of 17th century. And it's not to be turned into fertile land by turning into an ecological vertical farm, but it will be purchased using spatial data available.
This is a huge issue. We've actually had to, I've turned down a lot of big investment offers from real estate companies that just wanted to buy the heck out of our data and mess over the Catholic Church. And I've reported everything to the Secretary of State, and I've made a lot of enemies. But yeah, I mean, it's the transparency. It's a double-edged sword, right? But the thing, though, is if there is a digital land record available for a nation, say through an assessor's database or a nationwide digital land survey, or even subnational, people who are interested in real estate already have that information if they're big enough, you know. So like the fact that, so we made that map of nationwide Catholic data using, and we couldn't do that nowadays because we did it pre the Pennsylvania report. So when the Pennsylvania abuse report was released, all of the Catholic dioceses, I shouldn't say all, but many of them broke up their property into unrecognizable LLCs and legal entities, so that they could just go bankrupt and not have to collateralize them, which sounds really bad. And it is, because they should be knowing what they have and managing it well. But it's, you know, exactly what you said, like, well, someone's going to look at that and say, well, we should just put a vertical farm there. And the reality is, you know, this is the next kind of, I would say, well, it's sacred spaces for people. It doesn't matter what religion you are, but the property that you have designated, I would say parks are parks. I mean, that's a weighted word too, but natural spaces are sacred to me, as well as sacred spaces of my religion, but other people's religion. These are places where we grow and get in touch with something that is more than commercial, you know. And the issue of not knowing is already there. Anywhere you can know anything, people are already getting ripped off. You know, like this is a huge issue. Looking forward, when you talk about kind of these class differences and landholders and landlords in this acquisition, Pope Francis just had a great, absolute fire series of tweets the other day with his video on prayer for populist movements, because it's, I mean, I do think we are, I personally have not had, I don't have an existential crisis, but I have an economic crisis, because I think we are running on into the major issue, which is what the Pope gets to, which I think is what any of the green Islam, green Anglicans, green Buddhists, like anyone that has an ounce of like bringing the conversation of intangibles, of morality to the table. Even atheists, we can see that the issue at this point is greed. It's just unabashed greed. And you run the issue of the reaction to landlord ownership being a communist state, which is every time is bloody and is terrible and it hasn't worked. Because I'm not an economics expert, so forgive me, but my general impression is communism assumes that no one is a jerk. And once you get three of them, you get an oligarchy, whereas capitalism kind of assumes everyone is. So it's lasted functionally a bit longer, but the really big issue is that we didn't just stop and say what's going on the second anyone died in the supply chain. And it's fundamentally an issue of heart, and without a conversion of heart, and is it going to happen? I don't know. I don't want to see, this is where I think the Pope gives such good voices. We don't have time and we don't have bandwidth for another freaking revolution, for anything, to go. We don't have time. It's a crisis. Like you said, I've seen people who, when I was working in West Africa and Mali, it's done. It's game over. And, people, we're just gonna, I don't know how it's gonna happen, but we're just gonna have to get things done. That includes, when I talked about reconciliation with indigenous communities, that includes meeting on land. That includes, taking ownership through stewardship. And I don't say squat and occupy and take it, but really taking ownership through stewardship. Because if somebody has 2,000 properties that they're using as a hedge fund, that's a problem when there's homeless people. And if the Catholic Church is doing that, that's a moral issue. And we have to realize tangible assets carry heavy weight, especially property.
No, and
I don't have a solution. I'm sorry. I think it's very problematic, but I think it's
I think, again, I think it's important for us to recognize, just as you said something about very, very astutely about knowledge being a stewardship issue of stewardship, we do need to recognize that there is a sacred relationship we have with land, and that's not about labor. It's not what John Locke thought that land's relationship to personhood is.
Well, it's the same with knowledge, though. Look at academia nowadays.
Yeah,
the stewards of knowledge.
And we do need.
It's not just about creation. It's
we need to reinvigorate the sacred relationships that we have with space and land in order to have something left for anyone, our existing children, let alone generations. We have some really interesting questions I wanted to kind of bring to your attention. One series of questions is coming from Rodrigo Zorikomba, who is living in Leipzig. And he's asking about, basically in Argentina, efforts to the Archbishop of Cordoba to make 700 hectares of land available for social and rural organizations, and to return them to Aboriginal communities. And I think that such efforts are perhaps ongoing and existing in other parts. So maybe if you want to say a little bit about the church's relationship to indigenous both communities, but also with respect to land reclamation or land redistribution, if you want to say a little bit about those things. And if you have something
I think
on Argentina, please do.
Actually, I haven't, I don't know the specifics of the Argentina situation, more obviously with Canada. And what I will say is what I've seen in Canada, I don't know how it transfers this, the religious orders are doing a decent job. The Catholic hierarchy really mismanaged the funds in this whole process, sadly. I think it's very hopeful, this movement of reconciliation with land back in portions that are done intelligently and respectfully and responsibly, like what's going on in many parts of Canada. The maps enable, that's where I think this is critical. The maps enable a diocese to, where we see Jesuits and religious orders is specifically who are just jumping onto this and diving in and starting these conversations. Dioceses in places like Canada have been slower, and maps will help them to make up to jump over the hurdle of being like, oh, this is, which it's such an egregious crime that they're paying back for that it shouldn't be hurdled, but it can help that dialogue. You know, it is very, it's really important. And I'm really excited to see these kind of movements moving forward, because there is a common, I mean, we all share, I would say, a common heart of, you know, of respect for the land, and the Catholic Church didn't do that. And they didn't respect the people. And it's important to have these kind of transitions done well. Like I said, the worst case scenario is selling it all off and just using a bunch of money from underdone sales and just giving it to people, or giving it to the wrong people. So I don't know the details, but with the Jesuits, they're starting to do in Canada. They're just starting. It's hopeful.
So we have a couple of questions that are, I guess, centered on the question of the university. More specifically, one is from Sheila McMahon, who is writing from a Catholic university in Miami, Florida, asking again for how to push the university to use its holdings towards sustainable usage, and what that business model might look like. And similarly, Claudia Gonzalez writing with respect to Notre Dame and its kind of pastoral social, which I think perhaps is a project there, land restitution, and how these types of universities, which are, you know, Catholic universities that are also land owning institutions. Maybe you want to say a little bit about how you think the university is, Catholic universities particularly, are moving, in what directions you see them moving.
Yeah, this is actually very relevant. Notre Dame is one of the universities that invited me to go there, and I'm still trying to figure out how this can fit in with universities, because we haven't gotten requests only from dioceses. We started getting requests from municipalities, from governments. I mean, there's really Catholic healthcare is designed and became at the scale it is with the ideal. Now, it doesn't do this always, but with the ideal to give excellent healthcare with preferential option to the poor, to anyone who walks through the doors. A Catholic environmental program that steps out beyond advocacy and like prayer and to implementation needs to be implementable for anyone. It's not a vertical market, you know. So what we do for a Catholic diocese needs to be applicable for any large landholder. So this brings us to schools. I am really, really deep in thought about this, because I have provosts knocking down my door right now, and my question really is, I went to a very strange graduate program. I went to a Jesuit school for undergrad, and it was great. My mom taught at the school, so it was free. So I could found a company and take Greek for 2 years and argue the Nicene Creed until I became Catholic. But the graduate school I went to was founded by a landscape architect from Harvard's GSD, their design school, who studied his PhD on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and reimagined a totally different form of design education back in the day of Buckminster Fuller and Ian McHarg, and when landscape architects were still essentially making swimming pools for rich people. And we had this weird corner of design that wasn't materializing in the academy, and we're seeing bits and pieces come out, like the new school started, and it's coming more and more. But I think this I wish I had an answer for you, right? So my pondering about this is, I had a very strong background in design. I started publishing scientific media when I was 14, and science, given that. But at the same time, I went to this school, and there were 19 people in my cohort. We immediately started doing real world projects. Some of them made really ugly maps. Let's just say it. Their plan sets weren't good looking, but they were useful. And the question that I have is how a place like Columbia or Notre Dame, you know, this was actually what I'm still working on for Notre Dame, because I'm trying to, you know, really figure out the position of what we could do to leverage, like Paul Farmer with Partners in Health, you know, how we could create the interness of the environment to bring these experts where they're needed, and how we could do it in a way that's not going to create another $200,000 degree that's not going to solve climate change in time. You know, this is really like, and looking at my education and seeing, okay, so this person would be, say, a nurse of the environmental care program rather than doctor. You know, they're really critical, but they don't have that systems view. Whereas someone like me, if I do some hardscaping for you, or you want me to do some engineering work, that's not me. I have to call in the surgeon, to use the metaphor, and I think the school themselves, their land, is one piece of it. But the question that really has been at the forefront in my mind, especially with smaller educational institutions that don't have big endowments, they're all dying off. Like, how can they become sites of a different form of education that's communally based and you can't sell, are they going to be vocational schools, which is the direction that some are trying to go, like community colleges, which already exist, or can they be something else? And I wish I had a clear answer. Like, I am in the soup of this, trying to figure out what I can do that's going to be most useful, other than like a theoretical thing like agents of land change in an ontology, which I really need to do. And there's one university that I know that needs to have it up. But like this other piece of how we could do, like the Conway School. So their model, their current director, they don't have a current director, but when I was their director was absolutely phenomenal. And he brought in we had the best lecturers from UPenn, Yale, Harvard, and we were doing this. We would go into the field. It was learning by doing. It was no grades, but it was all pressure because you were dealing with real world consequences and a little risky, but University of Arizona tried to replicate their program and it didn't work. No one has really succeeded. So I've with that knowledge and that experience of being in that kairos of this really unique kind of, I would say, climax of where the school was. I think it could go there good, but looking forward towards these variables. So education, rising costs, closing colleges that are smaller, and also democratizing Web 4.0 if it works out, and open source, democratized education. Where can we plug in? I think it's this huge moment of question. I wish I had a clear answer.
No, thank you.
If I don't have a clear, yeah.
No, it's we're at the act time, so I want to just conclude. I want to thank you first of all for not just a very deeply thoughtful engagement, but also in your effort to reflect on what you do, what you practice, and both the kind of things that are unclear from where you sit and things that are unclear from where all of us sit. So we are both in a sense facing a set of problems that are uniquely both unique and general. And I want to say, I will end this by thanking Matthew Engelke and IRCPL and everyone who made this project, this conversation possible. But I do want to basically say one last thing, which is that an important part of what I think you have allowed us to glimpse in your work and presentation is the centrality of rethinking the place of religion, spirituality, sacredness, and belief in both a better world that has to be made right now because there are no alternatives, but also in reimagining things that we've taken for granted, not only capitalism, but also the church and the university. And all of these stress factors are being done without due thought given to the place in the making of these things, which faith and religion and spirituality had such an intrinsic part of it, even if it's about the conflict of these religions. But I think, as you mentioned, the tweets of the current Pope, there are all of various religious and non-religious peoples that are thinking about this issue are agreeing that we need to come together and rethink some of these things. And I think the model that GoodLands gives us and your practices allowing us to glimpse of is one such collaborative model. I will keep being susceptible to the horror that this is all going to feed into a developer buyout, but I also want to believe that we can build a better world. So thank you so much, Molly, for your time and your work. We deeply appreciate this. And thank you to all of our listeners and our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you so much.